The Tudors Dynasty Podcast.
Hello and welcome back to the Tudors Dynasty Podcast. I'm your host, Rebecca Larson, and today I am joined by friend of the show, Rosemary Griggs. Rosemary, welcome.
Hi, lovely to see you here at Dartington.
I am so excited. We met last weekend in person for the first time at the Wolf Hall weekend.
Oh, and wasn't that a wonderful weekend?
It really was.
Brilliant.
It was
Absolutely.
Nice to finally meet you in person.
Thank
after all
you.
these
Yeah,
years.
and you too.
Yes.
Lovely.
We spend so much time on social media, don't we, that when we get in the real world, it's
Absolutely.
nice.
It's just wonderful to actually see people in the flesh for the first time.
Yes. Well, as you mentioned, we are at Dartington Hall today.
Indeed.
So for our listeners and fans of the show who are unfamiliar with Dartington, can you give a little backstory on it?
Yeah, so Dartington's an ancient estate. We've found Bronze Age and Iron Age remains on the site, and we're very unusual. We've got a written record of the place in 833.
Wow.
When a woman called Bronwyn from Shaftesbury exchanged property there in a royal charter for King Egbert and came to Dartington. It's a great place because it's high above the River Dart. It's in a good strategic position. But it really comes to life after the Norman conquest, when it's given out to a number of Norman lords. The most notable of them are the Martin family. They're here till the mid-1300s, and then it goes, after a little bit of a hiatus, goes into the royal estate, becomes a crown property. And then the really important date is just in the tail end of the 1300s. This place is given by King Richard II to his half-brother, a chap called John Holland. John Holland builds his magnificent hall here down in Devon, a very prestigious place, never fortified because he was able to bring his huge retinue of followers with him all the time. And it's an absolutely wonderful stone building. It's got so much. I spend a lot of here. I've been a volunteer guide here for about 8 or 9 years, and I've also written about the place in my historical fiction. So
yes. So I do want to talk about your new book. Historical fiction is where I really started when it came to history, and I think a lot of people start with historical fiction, don't they?
Absolutely. It's a great way in to learning about the life of these times. But actually for me, it was a bit the other way around, because before I started to write my fiction, I was very, very much into research. The research came first, and that all kicked off actually after I retired from the civil service. I'm going to give away my age a bit here. I'd always loved history, but I was never able to follow it as a career. And like you, I started off reading historical fiction, the likes of Jean Plaidy, and then Anya Seton, Catherine, really blew me away when I was in my teens. I've always kept up the interest. The 16th century particularly has always fascinated me. I think it's such a century of change. And we all love the stories of King Henry's court and the Queens and Queen Elizabeth. But what really interested me was what it was like for people who weren't directly at the royal court, but were affected by all the changes that came in then. So I started to research, and I came across a woman called Catherine Champernowne. And I discovered that Champernownes are this incredibly well-connected, high-prestige family based down in Modbury. And Catherine will marry twice. She'll have 8, possibly 9 children. She becomes the mother first of 3 sons whose name was Gilbert, and the second one, Sir Humphrey Gilbert, well known because he set off across the ocean and he claimed Newfoundland for the English crown. After her first husband died, Catherine married a chap called Walter Raleigh, and he's the father of Sir Walter Raleigh. So her second family, she had another daughter and 2 more sons. And she's an incredible woman. I've followed her life, but she's ever so hard to research.
It is, isn't it?
Oh, researching women's lives is so difficult.
Yes.
But I was determined and dogged and trying to dig out the records. And one thing that was very helpful to me is that she's really unusual, because Catherine Raleigh, as she was then, she lived to see her name in print. And that was in Fox's Book of Martyrs. The second edition comes out in her lifetime in the 1570s. So Fox tells us this story of this poor Cornish woman, Agnes Prest, who in the time of Queen Mary, she just refuses to accept the teachings of the church, which the Queen now insists we've all got to go back to worshipping under the Church of Rome. And it's Agnes's own family who are going to shop her to the church authorities. Her husband, she gets hauled up in front of the Bishop of Exeter, and she refuses to change her mind, sent to the prison cells underneath Rougemont Castle in Exeter, which I think you saw probably on your travels.
Just yesterday.
Yeah. I can't imagine those prison cells were a very nice place to visit. But Agnes is sent there, and Fox tells us that this gentlewoman, Catherine Raleigh, goes and keeps vigil with Agnes on the night before. Agnes will walk out from that prison cell short distance to the area of Exeter we now call Southernhay, where Agnes is going to be burned at the stake. She was Exeter's one and only Protestant martyr during the time of Queen Mary.
Wow.
And that story really gave me lots of information about the sort of woman Catherine was. It also gave me the title for my first novel, because he calls her a woman of noble wit and godly ways. But the way I think about writing the fiction, Rebecca, is the historical record is a bit thin for women, but you do get these kind of milestones on their life's journey. You get these points which are totally immovable. You know something has happened.
Yeah.
And then for all the menfolk, you get a lot more of them. And the way I try to weave the story is by respecting what the record tells us, but weaving it in. So the research is first, and then the story can be woven between. And it's been a fantastic experience bringing this woman to life. I just thought, I've got to tell people about her. Why don't they know?
Yes. How do you tell her story?
And I thought first, well, yeah, perhaps it should be a really official sort of non-fiction biography with all the sources that I've found, all of that. But then I thought, actually, I'd like to reach beyond that audience to the people who, like when I was in my teens, want to read the stories of women who lived before them. So that's why I went down the route of fiction. And it's been an experience and a half to do it.
I think there's so many of us who are interested in history, and and especially maybe as women, we gravitate towards the story of these women in history. And like you said, it's so difficult to find information, but we want to know and we want to bring their stories to life.
Absolutely. And you really do have to work a lot harder if you're moving beyond the royal court and the very well-known characters. But what I found, one of the most useful ways of doing it is looking for all the family connections.
Yes.
Because the Champernowne family, they are related to everyone, and they've held positions at the court. There's a whole generation of them in this time in the 16th century, 6 girls and 2 boys in the family, and several of them do serve at the court. So my Catherine, as I call her, well, she had one sister. Oh, she actually had 2 sisters called Joan, but one of them, who is best known, was Joan, who married Sir Anthony Denny.
Yes.
He became groom of the stool to Henry VIII. And Anthony Denny, he's the one who's got the courage when Henry lays on his deathbed to actually say, this is it, time's up. Joan served several of Henry's queens, including Catherine Parr, and they seem to have had a lot in common. Joan actually was described by one historian as being a bit of a blue stocking. She was very much interested in the new ways of religion and reading and literature. And so she and Catherine Parr, I think, probably had quite a lot in common. And she's one of the ladies in waiting who was mentioned in connection with Anne Askew when all of that was happening. So you get the impression there, this is a sister who's quite highly placed in court. And there's another one who I'm convinced is a sister and not an aunt, as it's sometimes been reported, and that's the other Catherine Champernowne,
Right.
who we all refer to, don't we, still
Yes.
as Cat.
Yes.
I know recent thinking suggests maybe we should call her Kate, but everyone knows her as Cat.
It's hard after all these years to try and change that,
exactly. And you know, if I don't call her Cat, lots of people
Right.
won't know who I mean. So
Yeah.
let's stick with it.
Yes.
So Cat, as we know, she becomes governess to the young Elizabeth, and she's with Elizabeth all through that awful time with the Thomas Seymour business.
Yes.
And lots of people think Cat was rather remiss and took some odd decisions during that time.
Yeah.
But Elizabeth valued her and stuck with her, and she becomes eventually a chief woman of the Privy Chamber. So
Wow.
she is a high-profile figure in that Tudor world. And we've got a couple of boys in the family too, who do pretty well. The eldest one, John, there's a chap called Richard Carew, who wrote in the early 1600s his History of Cornwall, and he mentions John Champernowne in it. And he says that King Henry was very fond of John for his quaint conceits. So we think John had a position at court, probably when he was quite young. His father, Sir Philip Champernowne, father of all this family, he is groom of the squire of the body to King Henry, so he's in that fairly high profile circle.
Yeah.
John's at the court. His name crops up amongst the gentlemen pensioners, who are the elite guard who ride out with King Henry on ceremonial occasions. And John, along with his uncle, Sir Gawain Carew, is one of those who line the route when Anne of Cleves arrives in Greenwich. And John marries actually Catherine Blount, who was the sister of Gertrude Blount. And Gertrude, we know, married Henry Courtenay, Marquis of Exeter. So again, we've got a hugely close connection. But John decides, not long after his son Henry is born, that he is going to join another cousin of his, Sir Peter Carew, and go off to Europe. And they have all sorts of adventures in Europe. I don't know why they went. The records suggest that King Henry wasn't very keen to let them go at first, but then was persuaded. So I don't know if he sent them on some kind of diplomatic spying mission undercover.
What year was this?
This was in 1539-40. And eventually they start to come on their way back, and they're in Vienna. And there are Peter, John, and another chap called Wingfield, who they've met out there, all go down with some dreadful disease. Wingfield and John Champernowne die. Peter Carew manages to get back and tell the tale. So there's another one in the family who, you know, had he lived, who knows what role he would have played. But the one who connects us to where we are now, and that's really quite important for your listeners, is the younger son of the family is Arthur Champernowne. And he will become Vice Admiral of the Fleet of the West under Queen Elizabeth. And he actually marries Mary Norris. Mary has been married first to his cousin, who is Sir George Carew. I'm sorry, I feel as if I'm constantly name dropping here. But so Sir George Carew is the one we know who went down the Mary Road.
Yes.
So another big connection. So Arthur and Mary exchange a property near Exeter, St Catherine's Priory or Poleslow Priory, along with a few other land transactions, all wrapped up in the deal for this place at Dartington. It's probably in a bit of a rundown state when they come here. It was built in 1400 by John Holland. But it's a hugely prestigious place. It's a hall built fit for the brother of a king. You know, this is a fantastic place. So Arthur comes here, and he's quite a high-profile figure in Elizabethan history in those early years of Elizabeth's reign. Other family connections. He's got an uncle called George Carew who goes into the church. George Carew is one of those who officiates at the wedding. At the coronation of Queen Elizabeth.
Oh.
In fact, there was a bit of a hoo-ha about who would do the coronation, because some of them didn't like the way it was going to be done. You know, would it be Protestant, Catholic, whatever? And George definitely took a part in that. He was another high-profile figure in Elizabeth's time. And Arthur, he supported and took care of his nephew John Champernowne's son Henry. Henry Champernowne was a soldier. He went across and fought in France and in Europe, and he fought on the side eventually, with Queen Elizabeth's permission. He took about 100 men from Devon and from England to fight in support of the Huguenots, and they were getting huge persecution in France at this time. And in that band of cousins, brothers, whatever, young men who went with Henry, we include Sir Walter, a very young Sir Walter Raleigh, who was, of course, Arthur's nephew.
Right.
So huge connections here. And my interest really, though, I mean, I've got so much time for Arthur Champernowne. He's a great fellow. I hope we'll have time for me to show you his memorial in the church tower here, because he's a great character. I really have a lot of time for him, but I have made it my mission to write the stories of the women of Devon, and so I couldn't really tell entirely Arthur's tale.
Sure, yeah.
I've chosen to write the story in my second book. It's called The Dartington Bride, and it's the story of Arthur's daughter-in-law. She is the daughter of the Count of Montgomery. Her name is Lady Gabrielle Roberta Montgomery. Montgomerys were a family who came originally from Scotland, settled in France, and they rose to quite high-profile positions as soldiers and diplomats serving the French court. Roberta's father, Gabriel de Lorge, who becomes Count of Montgomery, he was the captain of the King of France, King Henry II, Scots Guards.
Oh.
Prestigious position at the court. And 1559, they're having a huge celebration in France. They've secured a peace agreement with the Habsburgs. They've managed the year before to get Calais back for the English, and now they've got peace with the English too. They always celebrate these things with marriages. There's two high-profile marriages. The king's sister and the king's daughter are married. They have a tournament to celebrate. And King of France I suppose he's about 40 by then, and he thinks he can still, cut a dash in the tournament, so he insists on taking part. And he's okay in the first couple of rounds, but then he challenges the Count of Montgomery, or Gabriel as he is then, to another tilt.
Yes.
And unfortunately for Gabriel, the lance shatters, goes into the king's eye, and after about 10 days, the King of France dies of his injuries in this jousting accident. So he now becomes the man who killed the King of France. Not surprisingly.
Not the reputation you want, really.
Not surprisingly, he leaves the country for a bit.
He's like, I'm going to leave for a little while.
The good thing is that the king on his deathbed has pardoned him. He said, "You're only doing your duty, it's okay." Good. But Catherine de Medici doesn't feel quite so happy about this. Yeah. She says she will never forget, and she actually adopts the broken lance as her emblem. So
really,
so Roberta's father, Gabriel, he goes first to the Channel Islands, he goes to Italy, and then he rocks up in England and meets all sorts of influential people like Robert Dudley and Sir Arthur Champernowne. Yeah. And while he's here, he's going to convert to Protestantism, and he is going to then become a Huguenot leader. And he fights in the wars of religion. A marriage is arranged between his daughter Roberta and Arthur Champernowne's son Gawain, and she comes to England to marry into the family. I'm not going to tell you how she gets on, but what is significant is that just about a year after the marriage, 1572, we have the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre.
Yes.
And Count de Montgomery, Gabriel, he escapes by the skin of his teeth. He has to ride out of Paris with the Duke de Guise and all sorts of soldiers following him. It's really, touch and go whether he gets away. But he does, and he brings his whole family then to England, and they seek refuge here at Dartington. So they are among one of the first waves of refugees we get coming into England. Quite a lot came in after after St. Bartholomew massacre. And as I say, I'm not going to tell you what happens to Roberta, because you're going to have to read the book to find out.
There's the teaser.
But all of this is stuff I've researched, but then I've got the story to tell. So it's that balance in historical fiction, I think, between respecting the absolute record, but also remembering that everything in the record, well, it's always going to be a bit partial. Someone has decided to write this down, and they've got an agenda. So, people often ask me, is it fact? And I find that a very difficult question to answer, because whose fact are we talking about? Exactly. So there are some things in the record that you have to question. You also got to interrogate. You sit here with this, and I absolutely love archives. I spend a lot of time in archives, and you sit there with this wonderful document with all the writing and the seals at the bottom, and if you're lucky, there's someone's signature on it. But I always then stand back from it and think, what's this about? Why have they written this? Whose point of view am I actually reading here? And that helps you to sort of weave a way through it.
Thank you for sharing that with me. I want to talk about what part of the country we're in, because we've talked about this briefly, right? We're in Devon. And Devon seems to be a spot where people aren't talking much about what was going on down here, because it's not London. Most of court life was happening around London, but now that I've spent 2 weeks in this part of the country, I'm realizing there's so much going on in Devon.
Absolutely. I'm absolutely thrilled that you've come down here to Devon, because sometimes people kind of think about it, it must have been a bit of a backwater in those times. Couldn't be much happening here because we're miles from the royal court. But I mean, I've said about all these family connections, we are important, but we're important for all sorts of other reasons down in Devon as well. We're hugely important to the economy of the country. The climate here, when we're sitting in lovely sunshine today,
so great.
But we do get quite a lot of rain, which grows wonderful green grass, which feeds sheep brilliantly. So we've always, for hundreds of years, we have been good at producing wool and woolen cloth. And we export that through our ports. We've got a very long coastline, and we've got ports like Dartmouth, we've got Plymouth, we've got Exeter. So that economic activity and trade has been lifeblood and matters to whoever's on the throne in London or Greenwich or wherever. And we've also got the tin from the moors. We've got mineral resources. They're also being exported. And then our merchants run ships which come back in with all the sorts of things we can't get our hands on here easily, like salt or wine or whatever. And that economic activity is really, really important. Exeter was one of the biggest cities in the country in the Tudor times. And because we've got the ports and the merchant ships running across the sea, they eventually they start to run into a bit of trouble with the Barbary pirates. So then the merchants decide it's a great idea if we put some guns on our ships and we arm ourselves and we learn how to fight. So it's not surprising that in the 16th century we get this generation of well-known Devon figures. Raleigh we've talked about, but Drake and Hawkins and Grenville, all of these names everyone knows. They are men who are good seafarers, but they're also soldiers, and they've got this turn of mind for exploration. They want to
Yeah.
go and find out what's on the other side, what's
Yes.
across the sea. And that all comes from Devon.
It
So
does.
I
think
really
it's
want to
great.
put Devon on the map.
Yeah, I am so, I feel like I'm an ambassador for Devon on this trip, like travel to Devon.
Absolutely.
If you
Well,
want.
do please come and see us here at
Yes.
Dartington, because it's a
Yes.
wonderful place.
It's beautiful. Rosemary, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank
It's been
you.
a pleasure talking to you. And for anybody who would like to check out your books, where can they find them?
You can find them for sale in all good bookshops. You can get them online through all the usual retailers as an ebook and also as an audio book.
Oh,
And I'm actually the narrator for the audiobook, which has been a
perfect.
wonderful experience to
I
do that.
bet.
So,
Yes.
so yeah, all the usual places, and I've got a website as well. So if
Okay.
people want to know more about me, it's rosemarygriggs.co.uk, and you'll find links to all my work. The other side of my work I haven't mentioned, which
Yes.
lots of people know me for,
Yes.
is that I also research and create 16th century clothing,
Yes.
which I wear for performances all over the West Country.
Yeah.
So people can find out more about that and about my research and how I make my clothes.
Yes. Well, we will include all of the links for Rosemary in the show notes as well. Again, Rosemary, thank you so much for
Oh,
being
thank
here.
you, Rebecca. It's been lovely to meet you, and I'm so pleased we've got a lovely day to sit here with this beautiful backdrop at
Yes.
Dartington.
It's been
Thank you
lovely.
so much. Thanks.
The Tudors Dynasty Podcast.